Welcome, everybody. If you're watching live, as always, please feel free to ask any questions along the way. If you think you might like to join me on the show yourself one day, please do get in contact. My details on the channel's About page. Next week, we'll be talking with Ryan Castellucci, but today it's Bryan Cantrill. Hello, Bryan.
Hey, Eddie, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Good. Would you like to just quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Bryan Cantrill. I am a software engineer, and I've been writing code for the vast majority of my life at this point.
Okay.
And have been worked for a computer company for a long time, Sun Microsystems, and then a cloud computing company called Joyent. And then most recently in 2019, I co-founded a computer company. So
amazing.
Rack scale computers.
We'll come on to that. So that's a big, exciting thing to talk about. Yeah. Great. So can we start off with your childhood? That's where I'd like to start. You mentioned you're in Scouts, and that was quite a formative part of your youth. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. Yeah. It's kind of funny because I think that I love the questions that you always ask folks about their childhood. I think it's really interesting to hear people talk about their childhood. I think you are also getting someone's slightly distorted perspective on themselves in that, we like to kind of make narratives that seem coherent. And so we like to kind of accentuate some details and maybe de-emphasize others to make our own lives make sense. And it's funny that you kind of asking about the Scouts, because that's not something I would have emphasized as a much younger engineer. As a much younger engineer, I would have emphasized the aspects of my childhood that are also important, about my first computer and writing basic programs and so on. And that was all really important. But when I got older, and especially when I started having kids, I realized that actually that bit that I thought was kind of an appendage on my childhood was actually really important for the formation of my own character. And I'm a big believer in the power of the outdoors and building character through the outdoors. So it was important for me growing up. I grew up in Colorado and grew up hiking and backpacking and skiing. And it's been fun to my kids are all in scouting, and that's been a lot of fun as well. So it's been really influential. It also has honestly been very influential for, especially when I got kind of back involved as an adult. Scouting has got these very clear principles and values, and called the Scout Law. And seeing the power of that really was very formative for Oxide. So Oxide has got very clear values and very clear principles, and we differentiate between those. And those are in no small part inspired by scouting. We even have one exact overlap. A point of the Scout Law that is also an Oxide value is thriftiness.
Okay, very good.
And it's funny, whenever we get a scouted Oxide, they're like, I recognize thrifty. Big believer in being very clear about it. Because when you're kind of clear about shared values, you can return to those shared values to help you deal with situations, kind of give you clarity. And we do that with the kids in scouting. We do that as adults, but we also do that very much at Oxide for sure.
Okay. So we have Scouts in the UK. I was part of the Scouts when I was young. Is it similar in the US? Is that basically the same thing? Just
it is basically similar. I would say that you can focus on the differences too, but
can you perhaps give a sort of an outline of the big things that you do?
Yeah. So we end up being in the outdoors, right? So you're hiking and you're backpacking. You're in the outdoors. You're having kids prepare their own meals. And that stuff is really that stuff feels universal, right? The kind of the challenge of cleaning dishes on a cold morning, that feels like that transcends space and time and place. And that kind of moment where, especially when you're young or you're old, those are character building, but because you're in, on the one hand, you're in the grandeur of the outdoors. On the other hand, you might be miserable in that moment, but you rarely look back and regret it. And you kind of look back fondly on what was a difficult time. And that to me ends up being a really good metaphor for a lot of the challenges in life. I think it's a great way to build resilience and grit and all these other things that we want to build in our kids.
Okay, very interesting. And you mentioned that this is something that you, perhaps a few years ago, even that recently, would have not necessarily considered as a large part of your childhood, that it was there and it happened, but it didn't form you. Can you talk a bit about how your perception of that has changed a bit?
Yeah, I think, as I got older, and especially as I kind of encountered shared adversity with folks, when you have shared adversity, you begin to values begin to really reflect themselves. And I've been dismayed about what's happened to Silicon Valley, honestly. Like when the Silicon Valley that I came out to in 1996 still felt idealistic at some level. And you can talk about, the military industrial complex origins of Silicon Valley, and that's all true. I mean, there are lots of kind of flaws in my own recollection of that kind of narrative, but it just didn't feel like the level of mendaciousness we have. And we've got some tech companies that are acting really, really badly. There was no one that was subverting democracy, to the best of my knowledge, when I was coming out in the mid-90s. And in particular, it felt like the internet felt like it was just alive with nothing but positive possibility. And as the kind of time passed, and you begin to realize that there are people acting really badly. And it's like, why am I not acting badly? Like, why does that... And where's that coming from? Where's my own character coming from? And I think that that's kind of, in terms of like, why does that seem more relevant to me now than it did then? I think it's like I see my own character in starker relief now than I did then. I think I you kind of assume that everyone's operating with integrity, and God, they should be, but
maybe they're not.
They're not. And I would like us to return to I would like us to be able to innovate, and I'd like us to kind of return to our roots of solving technical problems for the betterment of humanity, right? I mean, isn't that what we're all doing? That's why we're here, right? We are all, I think, what engineers are seeking to do is to solve technical problems to serve humanity. And I feel like that service bit has been lost. And I think it's in trying to kind of figure out where that comes from within myself that I think I've kind of gone back and seen some things in my childhood that were maybe more relevant than I gave them credit for at the time.
Okay. That's very interesting. Thank you. So if we turn to technology then.
Yeah.
And maybe talk about your first computer. Can you just fill us in a bit there?
Yeah, so the first computer I laid hands on, I think, was a North Star Horizon, which was one of these personal computers that was forgettable for sure, 8-bit computer. My father was a physician, but was really interested in computing. So he was kind of constantly bringing home machines. And actually the first computer that we owned was an IBM PCXT. In 1983, which is very early for a PCXT. So this had 256K of RAM, which was like almost remember, this is the 640K is good enough for anybody era.
Yep.
So 640K, to kind of put it in modern parlance, would feel like 2 terabytes of DRAM, right? Yeah. That feels like who needs that, right? And and I would say 256K felt like a lot of memory. A 10 megabyte hard drive, which was outrageous in 1983. One that I have to say was not hugely reliable. I got used to like on a cold day, a disk boot failure was pretty common.
Interesting.
And kind of got used to that. But the IBM PCXT, AMDEC monochrome monitor, still very much, feel very strong emotional bonds to Amber as a result. Mannesmann Tally printer. Because my father had this idea that he was going to start a software company, which was he was a physician. He wanted to start a software company for emergency departments. Better physician and perhaps technologist than an entrepreneur. Hadn't really done the math on how many emergency departments there are in the country. There aren't that many. And even if you assume that you're going to kind of like dominate this relatively small, this niche area of healthcare, it's hard to build a business that way. So the business kind of died on the vine, but I ended up with this at the time, ridiculously overpowered computer in a bunch of dimensions. It did not have a graphics card. So I was left having to write my own games, which is a very kind of, I feel this is like a very on-brand thing for a kid in the 80s being, I think I'm certainly not your first guest who was computer games and had to write them themselves.
Yep.
But I wrote my own terrible games. I mean, just absolutely awful, and really pined for something much better.
Okay. But when you say it had no graphics card, can you sort of outline or describe what it did have? Was this sort of a text only display, or was it?
Yeah, I mean, if you have an IBM PC without a graphics card, I mean, you've got the 80 by 24. Like that's what
it's just yeah. And
so
your games were character-based games, maybe text-based even.
Yeah, so I played there, and there were games. Then a little bit later, so again, you think about like how early this is. I mean, this is not just pre-internet. This is really pre-modem at that point. I mean, modems obviously exist prior to 83, but not in any. I mean, War Games comes out in 84, and War Games felt like something from the future. I mean, I'm sorry, there is not anyone my age who didn't want to be Matthew Broderick in War Games. I mean, the whole, I mean, this whole setup he had, and that was just like the unobtainable setup.
The dream. Yeah.
And of course, it was years later that, like, in particular, I remember being like, oh my God, that voice synthesizer is like, where do you get that voice synthesizer? And I don't know if you know this, but the reason that felt unobtainable is because it is unobtainable. There was no voice synthesizer. So do you know how they did that?
I wouldn't be surprised if it was like a vocoder or something. Just
no. What they did was so creative.
Okay.
They wrote the sentences down backwards and had I believe the actor that played Professor Falcon recorded those sentences but read them backwards, and then they snipped them back up and reordered them, so they sound wrong.
Okay.
So they sound synthesized, but that's actually just a human voice.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
I have to go back and rewatch. Yeah.
Totally right. In War Games, man, War Games holds up. That movie really holds up. Not all movies of that era hold up. In fact, most don't. I made the mistake of watching Knight Rider with my kids, and I don't know your vintage, but again, if you're of my vintage, Knight Rider was the absolute coolest thing that had ever happened. And I sat down and I talked it up with my kids. This is when they were much younger. I'm like, this is going to be like, get ready for this unbelievable moment. And we're watching it, and I'm like, God, this is terrible. Like, am I watching the same thing? Like, and the kids are kind of like, are you sure you're talking about the same thing? Like, this is not good. And finally, I think my kids were like 8 and 5, or 9 and 6 when we did this. I thought this was gonna be like bullseye. And at this point, I think it was even the younger kid that turned to me, is like, Dad, do we have to keep watching this? This is really bad. And you're like, this is bad. We do not have to keep watching this. But War Games is not bad. War Games is terrific. Okay. And so in that era, Matthew Broderick aside, Dave Lightman aside, we didn't really even have a way of getting there. You had to go to like a store to go buy a game. I didn't have money, right? So it was really hard to get a hold of this kind of pre-shareware and pre-freeware and so on. Obviously, all that stuff happened over those next couple of years with the personal computer explosion, and then getting a modem and being able to get on a BBS and being able to then, another one of these things that I probably am not giving enough credit in my youth. I worked in a mall software store. I worked at a Babbage's selling software, and then went to work for the rival across the mall, the Walden Software, because I was disappointed that the Babbage's was de-emphasizing their compiler stock. They were reducing their compilers, and I wanted to go sell compilers. So a young compiler salesman.
Amazing. Can you imagine today walking into a mall and finding a compiler for sale in a shop?
Right, and I can tell you, because again, I sold it. So Borland C++, for example, in 1990, that is a $399 compiler in a mall software store. And you think like that's a long time ago for $400. Like, how much is that today? That's $800, $900, $1,000 for a compiler. And I mean, there's a little bit, I think it's kind of funny because there's a bit of a Gen Z trend to kind of lionize the 90s. And it's like, sorry, kids, the 90s sucked. There is not a reason you'd want to go back to the 90s. I mean, yes, there was the idealism of the early internet was exciting and so on. And there were exciting elements about it, but they're only exciting because we know now how important those revolutions are. At the time, that's not what it felt like. And at the time, it was kind of like a solace for generational ennui. So anyway, yeah, no, it is, as you say, can you imagine paying that much for a compiler? Crazy.
Or even finding boxed software, which is a compiler. You know, the idea of going to PC World or whatever it is today and saying, can I have a compiler, please? They'd look at you funny.
They totally look at you. No, that whole era of proprietary software. And we kind of forget that like there are certain elements in our software stack that are permanently open now. And boy, are we the better for it. The fact that our compilers are permanently open. A proprietary compiler is basically impossible at this point, right? I mean, that's not a business model. And that's not the only layer of the stack in which that's true, in which proprietary software has been completely eliminated and it's all open. So I think it's like there can be this tendency to think of these things as getting worse. And in my regard, it's like, yeah, aspects have gotten, there maybe we have challenges, but broadly it's gotten a lot better as a technologist.
Great. So just to bring that sort of compiler discussion round in a loop, your North Star Horizon was an 8-bit computer.
Yeah, that's right.
Which had presumably some utilities. I don't know. Is it kind of the era of BASIC?
Yeah. So, that computer I used for a hot second, I kind of used its demos and then that thing was out of the house because it had to go back to, I think my guess is that my father was only evaluating it, but he ended up deploying on something called a YCAT, WYCAT, a computer company out of Utah, actually making and the reason actually is funny, I guess the apple did not fall far from the tree in this regard. The reason he deployed on the YCAT is because it was 68K based, but used memory protection. The one thing that was, shocking is that DOS did not use any memory protection. And for even Windows didn't really, I mean, the Windows was kind of a mixed bag when it came to memory protection. And it was only when I got to university that I realized that like memory protection was like, you could have a computer that would not simply spontaneously reboot when a program misbehaved. And that was that was a big moment for me in my life of realizing that like, wow, this is really, computing does not have to be unreliable. Computing can be reliable was a big eye opener for me.
Amazing. So let's talk about school for you. Sure. I think you were quite keen on sort of economics and research and things. Can you just sort of fill us in on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I had done computing. I had written programs. I had kind of fooled myself into thinking I knew how to write programs. I had exhausted the computer math curriculum in my high school and kind of went on to other things. I was like, check the box. Yep, I know how to program. Done. And it's like, I can program anything. And I mean, just like, it's just the unconscionable arrogance of a 14-year-old. It's ridiculous. And I mean, I enjoyed it, but it was definitely like it was something I did on the side. It was not something that I did not understand that it was academic. And it was always pretty academic as a kid. And so, yeah, when I was going to school, I wanted to study economics. I had a great economics teacher in high school. I had gotten onto a really interesting research project in high school. I thought I was going to be a mineral economist, like weird kid. And, growing up in Colorado, it was something that was, there was a molybdenum mine, the Climax molybdenum mine, which is one of the largest primary ore body of molybdenum in the world, or one of them, was constantly like laying off miners and then trying to hire them all back. And as a high school student, I'm like, what is going on there? And I discovered actually a pretty interesting relationship between molybdenum and copper. Molybdenum can either be primary produced as it is at Climax, but can also be byproduced where it floats as part of a copper process. And as it turns out, the copper producers were not reacting at all to molybdenum prices. So they can't open or close their mine based on moly prices. It's only based on copper prices. So you had this like half of the market, and that's what I was able to show, is that like half of this market is not reacting to moly price signals. They're only reacting to copper price signals. So they will sell into a glut and they will shut down when there's a shortage. And so moly prices just went completely nonlinear. And I remember thinking as a kid, I'm like, the only thing that actually makes sense is for copper producers need to buy moly producers, or moly producers need to buy copper producers. Like, they need to be one company so they can control this. And that's ultimately what actually happened. I guess that's the path. I could have been like, I guess, a mining executive. I'm not sure. I mean, super weird, like, path kind of. Anyway, I enjoyed that stuff, but I thought I was going to study economics. My mother really encouraged me as I was kind of contemplating schools. She's like, you might be interested in computer science. And I want to, because I'm not sure I conveyed to my mother at the time that I was listening. It's an important, I don't know, anyone who's got teenagers, it feels like they are never listening. I think the truth is that they are sometimes listening.
And they don't indicate it.
And they don't indicate it. But I definitely remember listening to that. And then when I went to school, I was kind of deciding between school that had an extraordinary economics program and kind of a non-existent computer science program, and a middling economics program, but an extraordinary computer science program, and ended up matriculating to the extraordinary computer science program. And really, I mean, and perhaps it ended up being self-fulfilling in that regard. When I kind of landed in my first real computer science course, hugely grateful to Leslie Kebling, who's a professor there. And I think she's now at MIT, maybe. I'm not sure where. Leslie, terrific researcher, great academic, great teacher. I encountered her right before classes started, and she really encouraged me to take the sophomore level computer science course based on my background. And that was great. That in many ways is kind of the most important single moment, certainly for me, in terms of doing what felt at the time like this hard pivot from economics to computer science, and realizing that, like, there's an academic discipline here. It's really deep. It's really interesting. I really enjoy it. I'm pretty good at it, but I think also importantly, and I think this is the really important measure of a true calling, when and where I'm not good at it, I still enjoy it. Like, I enjoy getting my butt kicked. That's the real, people, sometimes we gravitate only to those things that we've got so much natural talent at, we don't get our butt kicked. But there's a lot of value in getting your butt kicked. That's kind of the history for me in computer science, is like gravitating into harder and harder programs, and programs that I kind of had no business being in. But I really enjoyed getting these hard programs to work. And fell in love with computer science, fell in love again with system software when I took the OS class. And by the time I had interned for an operating systems company in Canada called QNX, which I had read about in Byte magazine, back RIP, and had read an article on alternative operating systems that included QNX. It's a microkernel-based operating system, and I was a big believer in microkernels. I am a big believer in microkernels. I cold emailed them. And managed to convince Dan Dodge and Dan Hildebrand, the late Dan Hildebrand at QNX, to give me a shot, and worked up there for 2 summers.
So this was like a summer job between years at uni.
Summer job between. I had wanted to go find interesting summer work, which can be hard to do in your earlier years, and was lucky enough to find it up there at QNX. And got to live, I like most Americans, I'm embarrassed to say this, and sorry, Canadians, but you know what I'm about to say. Like most Americans, I just hadn't thought of Canada. It just hadn't really occurred to me. It's like, it's not like Americans look down on Canada. They just don't think about it. And it was, it was a lot of fun to live. I mean, I was living in a foreign country, which was great. I loved Canada. I loved Canada. And that was an exciting experience in that dimension as well, to be in a different culture, albeit one that can be pretty similar in some deceptive ways to the US, but very much a different. So that was a lot of fun. After graduation, realized that my calling was for sure in system software, in the hardware software interface, but wanted to work for a computer company. And in 1996, every computer company, more or less with one exception, every computer company had decided that their future was Windows. And in part going back to my own experiences not having memory protection as a kid, discovering memory protection when I got to university. I definitely did not hold Microsoft in high regard, and I did
just
not
to fill in the gaps. We're still at sort of the error has occurred. Press Control Delete to reboot Windows. Sort of era, are we? Is that right?
We are in that era, and it's funny because it is true that like the Microsoft of the '90s was a villain. It was like finding a fact a villain. Like this is not my opinion. This is like the United States government found that I mean, and Microsoft subverted innovation. It was, I mean, it's like I God bless Bill Gates curing tuberculosis and whatever he's doing now. But the guy was a real bastard in the '90s and was really cut off a lot of innovation, had products that weren't that good, that were insecure, that were, you're rebooting the operating system. It had kind of slow support or poor support for memory protection. It was really only with Windows NT they got to a true protected mode operating system. And it is funny because that has really changed. Like the idea of a villainous Microsoft seems very foreign, I think, to young people today, which was really hit home for me when we had someone that we were trying to hire at Joyent. This is in 2016, trying to decide between Facebook and Microsoft and Joyent. And obviously, I wanted him to come work for Joyent. And he went to go work for Facebook. And my view at the time was, well, at least it's not Microsoft. So I can still like respect him as a human being. The millennials I worked with, who were much closer in age to him than they were to me, they were both, the millennials were like, we are disgusted with this, like that he went to go work for Facebook. And it was when I began to realize that actually, like the problems that I had with Microsoft, this generation rightfully had with Facebook, and it was beginning to realize that like Facebook is more than just a social media site. Like there's actually there's some deeper things going on in Facebook, and of course that was before we realized that they had an adversely affected the election and so on and so forth. But so that was, and for those that are millennials, view Microsoft of the '90s as the Facebook of its day. And I was not going to go work for Microsoft, and I was not going to go work for any computer company that was going to have Microsoft as their operating system strategy. And I was a big believer in Unix, and that meant that there was one company that stood with Unix, and that was Sun Microsystems. So I went out to work at Sun in 1996, and feel very fortunate, in part because Sun was so differentiated in that regard. We were able to attract an extraordinary group of folks and worked on, actually it was funny, someone was asking on Twitter, if you could go back in any kind of time and work with any team, who would it be? And, people are the usual kind of like, Xerox PARC or the development of the Mac. But I saw a couple of folks who were like, God, I would love to have been in like Sun late '90s, early 2000s. That was like the place to be. And it was true. I mean, so much OS innovation came out of that era and that group of folks. And I feel privileged to have been a part of it and to have my own contribution to that.
So was that straight out of uni, straight into Sun? Was that sort of how it went?
And straight out of university.
What was the job, and how did you get it?
So it was in Solaris kernel development, and I got that the same way I got the job at QNX. I had cold emailed Jeff Bonwick. Bonwick was the gatekeeper for Solaris 2.5, and he had a posting to Comp Unix Solaris explaining explaining everything that was new in 2.5, and Solaris 2.5 was the OS release that very much saved the company. That was developed UltraSpark at that time. And from my perspective, I didn't, I kind of held Sun in maybe middling regard. It was kind of hot and cold, but this email was an extraordinary email. And I realized that, like, okay, this is the person I need to, I've kind of been, my resumes have been kind of sent off to kind of middle management folks, in other parts, but this is the person I need to talk to. So I emailed them and be like, here's what I want to go do. And Jeff responded immediately, and I got me out to interview with the team. And the day, and I had only corresponded with him. I had not actually seen him in person. And I remember my first thought, just because, you know, I'm a young graduate. I want to go work at a computer company on system software, just dealing with a lot of folks that are later in their career, bluntly. And when I was in Kevin Clark's office interviewing with Kevin Clark, who was a young, energetic guy, and in bursts as young, energetic guy in Jeff Bonwick. And, you know, when I kind of went out there, even then, I did not think I was going to work for Sun. I thought it was more likely that I was going to go to SGI. But being with them and their enthusiasm, and Jeff in particular, sculpted my career a lot. Jeff was a big believer in the kind of the pedagogical power of comments in source code. And so wrote some terrific comments, which are blessedly all open source now. When we open source the operating system, there's a lot of great works of literature that we effectively open source with it. That very much affected my own engineering. One of the things I saw and appreciated in Jeff is when you have to write down why a system works the way it does, you are forced to really to really rethink your own ideas. I mean, it really stress tests your own ideas. And in many ways, like in writing the comment, you are likely to realize, like, oh, wait a minute, I have forgotten about a condition here. There's something I went to go explain, and I realized because I can't explain it, I actually don't completely understand it myself.
Scratch the surface a bit harder, yeah.
Totally. And I think that has, I'd like to believe that has cast a long shadow. I have done that in my code. I believe that I've inspired other younger engineers to do the same. And I'm a big believer in writing down your ideas and then having those ideas ideally live with the code itself. I think is really important. So that period was a really important period, really pivotal period in my own career.
Very good. So are you willing to talk about the projects you got up to at Sun?
Yeah. So, I mean, I did a bunch in kernel development. Putatively came out for I guess it was Solaris Performance technically, but we were all kind of all over the map. And I realized pretty quickly that we needed much better infrastructure and tooling to understand what the system was doing. And when the system was going on a vacation, where the hell was it?
Come back.
And we were kind of stuck using pretty crude tools to figure out what the system was doing.
By crude tools, are we talking like printf type debugging type level? Or?
So we are talking. Well, so you can't use printf debugging at all on a running system, right? The system is running, so you can't. And what I ended up, and we kind of had this very pivotal moment shortly after I'd arrived at Sun. We had a benchmark. So we had when I arrived at Sun, we had bought a company from SGI, actually, the Cray Business Systems Division, and they made a 64 processor machine. So 64 processors, 64 gigs of RAM, big honking machine in 1997. And we had a benchmark that had 4 of these things that were actually 5 machines total because one was a benchmark machine.
Right.
And so the 4 E10Ks were feeding the one. The one was actually running a gigantic SAP benchmark. And what we would see is there were these prolonged periods where the operating system would disappear doing God knows what.
Okay.
And it was very frustrating because if the operating system could stop distracting itself in this unknown way, we could see that it was on track to kind of beat the world record for this benchmark. But these periods of distraction were the difference between first and worst.
I love the way you're describing this as a distraction. You know, it's almost personification of the computers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got to anthropomorphize these systems for sure. Absolutely. And it's just doing what it's told, right? So it somehow is being told that it needs to go off and frenetically do something that is not what we've been tasked to do. And in particular, I was using so Jeff had written this tool in Source 2.6 called Lockstat, which allowed us to understand what the kernel was doing from a lock primitive perspective. And I was using that I was kind of modifying that driver and kind of dynamically reloading it to affect an idea that I'd had actually earlier at school, which is why can't we use printf debugging on a running system? Like, why is it that yes, I've got a statically compiled binary, but why can't I modify that running program text to emit data at points of interest from me?
Mm-hmm.
And I was starting to get to some of that with Lockstat, but realizing that like we actually need to think about this very comprehensively. And that was the kind of the seeds of what became DTrace, which is this facility I developed that does allow you to do effectively printf debugging on a running system, because you can dynamically instrument it, and it's designed importantly to be dynamically instrumented safely. So you can dynamically instrument a production system, you can dynamically instrument a system without fear of actually crashing it. Mm-hmm. And that very much came out of the problems that I was working on at Sun. So DTrace was very much informed by those problems. And it's something, I mean, this is part of the great thing about software. It's a technology that we still use at Oxide every day. So it's something that, that is still, even though there was kind of a prolonged period when we were working on DTrace where it felt like it would never be done, the reality is it's been done for a long time, and it's something that we still use all the time to help understand why systems are behaving the way they are.
Okay, fascinating. What was the issue, may I ask? Do you remember?
Yeah, I'm sorry for not giving the punchline there.
No, that's okay.
So the kind of the issue, we did resolve it, and the resolution was chilling, because I had felt the entire time, we knew it was in the networking stack, and because this does predate DTrace, it was very hard to figure out what it was doing and why. We ultimately did figure it out. It was in the networking stack. That is true. But the reason it was in the networking stack was disconcerting. Mm-hmm. What had happened is elsewhere, this is a lab environment, and the benchmark machine had been misconfigured in a way that's very easy to misconfigure a machine. And in particular, it had been configured to act as a router.
Okay.
But there was another router in the lab. And the problem was this other router would occasionally just reset. And when the other router died, the E10K is like, oh, excuse me. I know that I'm running this SAP benchmark. I also know how to be the world's worst, slowest router. So I can route packets, and it would start routing packets and hitting all of these paths in the networking code that are really not designed to be hit under load. So all these kind of quadratic paths and so on. So yeah, it went from the world's best SAP server to the world's worst router, until that router ultimately came back. And when the router came back, it would start routing packets, get back, oh, okay, now, where was I? So, and the reason that was chilling is like, wait a minute, that is a problem that anybody could have. That would be a super easy problem to have. Mm-hmm. And how is anybody, we had, in part because the system was so incredibly expensive, we had the best and brightest at Sun on this problem literally 24 hours a day following the sun in different geos. Like we had it working on this problem for 2 weeks. It was how long it took us to resolve that. What would a customer do? Yeah. What would someone do and the answer is they wouldn't be able to solve it. And this is kind of this big realization that like we need to provide, and it's incumbent upon us in the operating system to provide much better tooling to understand what the system is doing. And this is kind of one of my core beliefs as a software engineer, is that tooling is not something that is orthogonal to a system. Tooling needs to be part of a system. That when you develop a system, we should expect that system is going to give us the facilities necessary to understand why it's not behaving. And this is a theme that has kind of played out again and again in my career. So I think it's pretty deep in my marrow. I think it's pretty important to me. But certainly you saw that a lot with DTrace for sure.
Okay, that's amazing. I love hearing stories like that. It's horrific, but well done for solving it. So I think another thing that you're working on at Sun was Fishworks. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So I was in kind of kernel development and had finished up DTrace or such. DTrace was kind of like, and it had been, DTrace was kind of, a lot of people were discovering it, which was great. And that was exciting. But as beginning to think about kind of what was next, really wanted to go, Sun had great pieces, great components, but not necessarily great products. and really saw an opportunity to go build in particular, Sun had invented network attached storage, NFS, but had literally zero share in the NAS space. And we saw as an opportunity to really build a real product that would be hardware and software together, and really designing the entire system. And so we wanted to do that as effectively a startup within Sun. Took a page from the literal book on Skunkworks at Lockheed. Ben Rich has got an excellent book called Skunkworks. And one of the things that was very important, Skunkworks in kind of Silicon Valley slang has become this idea of doing something without managerial authorization. But that's not what the actual Lockheed Skunkworks was. So Clarence Kelly Johnson, inarguably the world's best aircraft engineer, very famous aircraft engineer anyway, aeronautical engineer, was doing these commercial applications, wanted to work on military applications, went to the CEO of Lockheed and said, we're going to set up the separate facility for me. And I want to be on separate real estate. I want to make separate hiring decisions. And then I'll report directly into you. And so we basically did the same. We took that kind of Skunkworks model, went to the CEO of Sun, CTO at the time, Greg Papadopoulos, and we got set up in our own real estate, Class B real estate in San Francisco, across from the old bus station before that was demolished. And people complain about San Francisco now, and it's like, folks, this is not like this is San Francisco has always been kind of a last stop for people, and definitely the bus station was kind of where people might have had dreams of being in San Francisco. They get those dreams hit reality on that corner where they kind of rolled out into San Francisco. But we were, and actually at the time, they were very resistant to us being in San Francisco. I remember that this is still in the hangover from the dot-com bust. This is 2006. Right. And McNeely's line was, I've got 100,000 empty square feet in Santa Clara. Why can't they work there? And I think Greg realized it's like, yeah, I think if we tell them to work in Santa Clara, I don't think they're going to work at Sun. I think it's going to be, I think it's kind of like we need to accommodate these folks or they're going to leave. And honestly, a time-honored tradition at Sun. That's kind of how Java started. That's the way Spark started as well. And we knew that time-honored tradition. So fortunately, and this is, again, I would like to believe this is kind of the very best of Sun, is that they did set us up, and we had our own real estate and had our own team. And from 2006 we shipped that product initially in 2008, and it was really successful. And we saw the power of integrating hardware and software. It was also way less successful than it should have been, in that we got bit in the butt by every piece of firmware in that system. And that system was nowhere near as robust as we thought it was when we shipped it. So when we shipped it, we thought we had a really robust system. And what we actually saw in the field as at disk firmware, SAS expander firmware, HBA firmware, the BIOS, the system management firmware, it was like a party, and every piece of broken firmware was invited to kind of stab this product in the throat. So it was really tough. The first kind of year and a half of shipping a product was really, really tough as a result, and very formative. I mean, I'm very much informed what we've done at Oxide is from some of those early days.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that.
Yeah, I mean, because when you and we kind of develop these ecosystems of sedimented firmware because we need abstractions on which to build. So it's not wholly unreasonable. The problem is that these layers are entirely proprietary, and proprietary software, as you're talking about with that $400 compiler. Proprietary software has known problems with it. And there are a bunch of patterns. And if you wonder what it's like to develop software in the 90s, look no further than firmware in present day. And there are a bunch of problems. One, you are constantly reinventing everything. So, and you see these where firmware teams feel like they're kind of on constant death marches, because you've got a hardware product that needs to ship on time. We're going to ship it no matter whether the software is ready or not. The software is often a very important component. And because it's not open, you're not benefiting from a bunch of the things that you get when you've got an open source product or project. You don't, there are no other eyes on it. There's no community associated with it. There's no other applications for it. And it was a real problem at Fishworks, and very much informed what we wanted to go do at Oxide.
Okay. So if we could just sort of fill in what Fishworks was doing, what the product was. You said it was a NAS, that's network attached storage.
Yeah, it was a NAS box. It was a series.
And you sort of provide storage for other people's compute, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. So this is for NFS. This is sharing out NFS. So this is, maybe back in the day. This is, like this is like cloud computing on the LAN, I guess. I'm not sure how they kind of phrase this to a modern audience. But this is serving up network attached storage on a local area network effectively.
Okay. And what kind of scale are we talking? Is this like a full rack's worth of equipment?
Yep. So our smallest product, codenamed Iwashi, was a 2-year product that had, I think, 14 spindles, 14 2.5-inch drives. Our largest product would be Otoro, or actually then we did one that was even larger, but that had hundreds and hundreds of spinning disks. I think.
Okay.
388, something like that, 3.5-inch drives attached with JBODs, just a bunch of disks. So you would have a clustered NAS head that then had a bunch of JBODs hanging off of it. And the cabling of those JBODs became really, there's a whole bunch of problems that we had as a result of that were very, very formative.
Okay. And is this potentially any relation to ZFS then? Is this where ZFS came from, or is this
it is not where ZFS came from, but we very much use ZFS. So ZFS was by Jeff Bonwick and Matt Ahrens, and ZFS's development had started around the same time that DTrace started. So DTrace started in November 2001. ZFS is about the same time. There's another project before that called Pacific that had just kind of gotten canceled, or been kind of recast itself. And so ZFS is roughly concurrent with DTrace, which part of actually made it a very exciting time. That ZFS and DTrace, the service management facility, there were a bunch of things that were happening at the same time. ZFS had gotten robust enough to be, it was integrated in the system, like all of our data was on ZFS. Definitely ZFS, I think it's not unfair at all to say that a lot of present day ZFS is because of what we put it through with Fishworks. In particular, this is where you begin to hit the things that are not, as I often said, we didn't lose anyone's data, but it took some very long vacations. And so doing things like snapshot deletion or deduplication can be really rough for a bunch of reasons. In particular, any workload that is going to turn streaming writes into random reads, which you definitely can have with dedupe, for example. If you have in a dedupe implementation, if you do not have data cached, in order to be able to perform this write, I may need to perform some number of random reads to be able to understand if I have this block elsewhere on disk. So I dedupe it. That can be crushing for performance. And perhaps even more pressing was large snapshot deletions, and how we were doing large snapshot deletions, kind of recasting that. So I would say that Fishworks was very intimately involved with ZFS, but ultimately as a consumer of ZFS, and as occasionally a conveyor of specific kinds of urgency around different problems that really needed to be badly addressed. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, fascinating. Very cool. So I think from Sun you moved on then to Joyent.
Yeah, that's right. So I from Sun, that's putting it gently. Well, from Oracle, right? So Fishworks was really successful commercially, and in particular attracted Oracle actually as a customer. For the first time in a long time, Oracle became a Sun customer. I feel a little bit of residual guilt over this. I feel like I attracted this marine apex predator. I feel like we were kind of chumming the waters inadvertently, because Oracle and Sun was struggling for a lot of reasons. Sun, and it's kind of an open question whether Sun could have made it in its embodiment, but it definitely didn't. And HP and IBM were kind of vying to buy Sun, and Oracle took advantage of their mutual animosity for one another and bought Sun. Did definitely not see that coming. I went into the acquisition with a very open mind. In hindsight, a bit of a mistake, because Oracle is really a caricature of software villainy. This is what if Microsoft may have been a villain in the 90s, but even in the 90s would deny it. Oracle just seems to embrace the twirling mustache and the top hat, and just loves playing the part of the villain. And I learned a lot about myself immediately after the acquisition, which is I learned that I don't want to be ashamed of my employer. And I, with Sun, I was frequently embarrassed, but I was never ashamed. And with Oracle, I was like ashamed 3 times a day. Oracle's customers hate them, and they hate them because Oracle views them with contempt. And for me, and it cuts into that, like, what is the purpose of an engineer? And an engineer ultimately is to serve humanity. And you can't really do that if your customers hate your guts because your pricing is so rapacious. So I realized I had to leave Oracle. It was really tough because, this team had been, we had a really coherent team at Fishworks. And I had, for every one of these engineers, I had persuaded them at some level to join me and, across from the bus terminal in San Francisco and do this kind of nutty thing. And I was going to be the first out the door. And that's really tough for me. It's out of my character. And I think I realized how much it was out of my character. So one of the things that was important for me was to find an opportunity that could take as many of those engineers as wanted to join me. And we obviously everyone was kind of free to make their own choice, but my choice was not going to be, I just could see where Oracle was going, and I didn't want to be a part of it. So I joined Joyent as the VP of engineering there. And part of the quid pro quo there was like, look, I may have a lot of engineers that I want to go hire, and I need to know that I can go hire them. I did end up bringing a bunch of them to Joyent, and then a bunch of those onto Oxide. So I've got engineers that I've worked with at Sun, at Fishworks, at Joyent, and now at Oxide.
Very good.
And which has been great. I mean, those deep relationships are extraordinarily important to me. And I feel very, very lucky that some folks joined me, certainly at Joyent, and then again at Oxide. Feel lucky to keep working with them. So we at Joyent, Joyent was a cloud computing pioneer, was the company behind Node.js, real container pioneer, was a big believer in zones, OS-based virtualization, which I was also a big believer in. And that there were a lot of reasons why it was a great technical fit. It was culturally, I would say, I think made me realize that my next step is definitely starting my own company, because I definitely wanted to set the first cultural cornerstone. And it was, it was a startup making kind of like, I would say, very typical startup mistakes, but they were definitely making mistakes, over hiring sales before they actually had product market fit, raising money. And I remember having a disagreement with the one of the co-founders at the time, because he wanted me to stop calling Joyent a startup. And I'm like, okay, but we're like venture funded, and we rely on venture funding to make payroll. So yes, I mean, we have revenue, we're a post revenue, but we're a startup. And you get this kind of denial of reality that's not atypical, but definitely formative for me. And I think for Steve Tuck, my co-founder at Oxide, about the way we wanted to run things was different. And we wanted to run things where we wanted to be completely transparent with folks about where we were and where we aren't, and transparent with customers about where we are and where we aren't. And we saw that as an opportunity to go build something that was honestly more ambitious, but we felt more pressing, which was building this kind of rack scale machine for this on-prem cloud computing use case, which we had tackled at Joyent. Joyent was bought by Samsung in 2016. I should say it's kind of important detail.
Okay, so just quickly sort of summarize then. Joyent was, I think, cloud on commodity hardware. Is that what you said?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And so it was a software project, if inverted commas.
Yeah, that's right.
To deliver this product to the customers.
And so we built this software substrate, a control plane to the API driven infrastructure. We built it. We operated it ourselves. We open sourced it, which was great. Open sourced it in 2014. It's called Smart Data Center, now called Triton. We operated it ourselves, and then we also made it available for people to actually consume the software. So we had customers that were running their own on-prem clouds, running our software, which is great. And we had customers in the retail space, we had a couple different areas, a couple different verticals. In doing that, we also realized the peril of not controlling the entire stack. So in particular, we had one customer, huge customer, very happy, who was deploying many racks of Joyent software, and they went to go buy another rack of the same Dell SKU they had. So they're basically like, I want to expand this thing. Seems reasonable, and nothing worked. And it's like, why does nothing work? And you go in there like, oh, because everything is different here. That the Dell part number is the same, but the HBA is from a different company. Right. I'm embarrassed to say this. I did not know that Toshiba made hard drives until I was debugging a latency issue in our own data centers. So I was I'm like, why do we only see this in this APAC data center and we don't see it in Amsterdam, we don't see it in US East. And I'm debugging this thing and debugging this thing and debugging this thing. And then I'm like, I think this is a drive firmware issue. And I'm seeing these latency outliers, these like 2,700 millisecond latency outliers. And like, I'm looking at a drive firmware issue. Like, what version of HGST's firmware, because we were running both HGST drives and Seagate drives, what version of HGST firmware am I running here? And I looked at it, and I mean, there's this moment of like, Toshiba makes hard drives? I mean, it's like, these things were running in our data center, and we had no idea, because Dell does not sell you, they sell you a Dell hard drive, because you shouldn't care about those details. It's like, yeah, I actually do care about those details, because those details are meaningful, actually.
Yeah.
And when we had this, this external customer that had a rack that didn't work, and we had just example after example after example after example, and we were crippled by the fact that we were not able to control the entire system. And I remember in particular this one customer, retail customer, telling me, it's like, hey, can you guys just please tell me when you're going to actually make hardware so I can just buy it from you? I'm like, we need to go do that.
So that leads us directly onto Oxide.
Directly to Oxide. And, Steve and I knew we wanted to go do something together. In the kind of the shared adversity of Joyent, I definitely learned people that I wanted to work with again. And Steve and I both had a real shared perspective on the way to conduct ourselves, the way to operate things. Steve had come up on the go-to-market side at Dell, and had been running the Joyent public cloud, and was running all of Joyent under Samsung. So Steve and I knew we wanted to go do something together, and we were beginning to brainstorm about what should we go do. And I was we got to the point where we had a bunch of very bad ideas. I wanted to go remind myself of because I had lunch with venture capitalists on and off. And I had lunch in particular on a somewhat regular basis with a VC who's actually become pretty famous now. And I went back to remind myself of his email address. And the last email he had sent to me was, hey, great, really enjoyed lunch with you. Just wanted to remind you, I will fund literally anything you put in front of me.
Wow. Okay.
And it's like, I remember being in Steve's office being like, Steve, he says he's going to fund, if he's really going to fund literally anything, that we put in front of him. Like, don't we have a responsibility to society
something in front of him
to do the most? Don't we have a responsibility to our fellow technologists to do the most audacious thing and I'm like, we should solve the problem that we actually want to go solve, which is this whole system rack level computer problem. And I just remember Steve being like, God, do you think, like, are we allowed to do that? Like, are we allowed to do something that big? And what we discovered is that it is, on the one hand, very contrarian. On the other hand, as we talk to technologists to a technologist agreed, like, yes, this time has come. Like, why is the world stuck buying Dell, HPE, Supermicro when in a Google data center or an AWS data center or a Meta data center or a Microsoft data center, those machines look nothing like what those folks can buy. And they don't even look the same, right? They've got a DC bus bar. This is true rack level thinking.
Right.
And what we have been stuck with in the commercial market is effectively rack mounted PCs. And it was really time, and especially as we talked to our fellow technologists, got some real enthusiasm. As we talked to customers, believed it was overdue. Venture capitalists found it intriguing, exciting. But
was it a hard sell, or was it as easy as the email might have indicated?
Emphatically not. And in fact, when we what we discovered is, I'll tell you what was an easy sell. VCs are definitely intrigued. It's like, okay, this is interesting. Like, it's a big market. And in fact, they were a little too intrigued because the thing you do not want out of a venture capitalist is like a long no. Right. And they just say, where they spend a lot of time and they dig deep and they come away being like, we just can't get over the line. Right. And that was, I would say, pretty common where venture capitalists, I mean, I think it's pretty common in general, but I think that the kind of the challenge with this is it's a little bit of VC catnip, because they think, like, wow, this is like a big idea. This is the right team. This is like the right way to think about it. As we talk to technologists, we know that this is overdue. The ones that did their homework really well, they would talk to customers and realize that, like, oh my God, this is the customers really want this, but boy, it's big, and it's real big. So, and we when we raised, I'm not sure if I believe it or not, but we had one, probably the most famous venture capitalist, who derided what we were doing as the largest seed he'd ever heard of. He has since funded larger seeds, I'd like to point out. But VCs were intrigued. Ironically, and as we were talking to enough VCs that were intrigued, it's like, okay, we know, like, this will get, we think we can get this funded. We went back to that VC that had sent us the note. I pitched him on it. I got maybe like 30 seconds into it. And he's like, wait a minute. I'm going to stop you right now. Please tell me you're not about to start a computer company. I'm like, no, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're starting a computer company. He's like, absolutely not. No way. Nope. Do not want anything. And I'm like, you sent me this email saying that you would fund, quote, literally anything I put in front of you. He's just like, nope. I'm like, okay. Wow, I guess that's okay. Right. But what we did find is, and when you do something that's like big and bold, you kind of self-select, and that the VCs that are the wrong fit will select out. And because, like, you're not funding Oxide because it's trendy. You're not funding Oxide because there are 3 rival startups. You're not funding, you're funding Oxide because you believe in what we're doing and you see that the customers are there, that the market is there, and this is overdue. And so when we came to Eclipse Ventures, which ultimately ended up leading our seed, it was like oxygen. And they were absolutely got it. And what we understood after the fact was, they had seen this opportunity independently, and they were waiting for a company to come along that was taking a swing at this.
Wow, that's quite a matchup you managed there then.
It's a great match, and it's felt very lucky to have it. And the Eclipse, and felt even lucky again in that the Eclipse partner that is on our board, in addition to Seth Winteroth, a great, terrific partner, but the senior partner on Oxide is Pierre Lamond, who Pierre hired Andy Grove at Fairchild Semiconductor.
Mm-hmm.
So Pierre he was the CEO of NatSemi. He was with Don Valentine at Sequoia. I mean, we are his 63rd company, and it's my understanding is I believe we are his last company. But Pierre is terrific. It has been it has been really amazing. I learned very quickly, like, you can't call him a legend. As I said, it's great to meet like the legendary Pierre Lamond. He said legends are dead. And I'm like, correction on legend, please ignore legend. But Pierre has got a great boldness that venture capitalists don't always have.
Right.
And Pierre, I mean, he's not foolhardy by any means. But he's bold and he's willing to take technical risk. And if you look at the other companies in their portfolio, there are companies that are taking big, exciting technical risks.
Okay.
And one of the things that I counsel folks is, actually, if you're interested in working for a hard tech startup, go find the good firms that are funding hard tech startups and walk their portfolios. And you're going to find a company that's like, wow, this looks really interesting. And there's so many companies and they're not the only firm there are other firms that are like this, but you look at a bunch of the firms in their portfolio, like, wow, these are really neat companies solving hard, important, and relevant problems.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, the world is bigger than the FANGs, for sure.
Okay. Very good. So, are you able to give us kind of a elevator pitch, a summary of what Oxide does? What's it set out to do?
Yeah, so Oxide is taking those computers that Google and AWS and Meta have designed for themselves, and we are designing it as a rack scale computer and making it available for the commercial enterprise, making it available for people to buy. It includes all the hardware and all the software. So importantly, we've got an integrated switch. So we've done our own compute sled based on AMD Milan. We've done our own switch, and again, for good reason. Like for all of the reasons why the Dells and the HPEs and the Supermicros really need to be revisited. We revisited it at the most basic layers, and the reality is, once you start you can't revisit a little bit of it. Once you start revisiting it, you are taking a clean sheet of paper. So in particular, there are a couple of things that we knew we wanted to go do. We knew we wanted to change the enclosure geometry. So this sounds very physical and basic, as it is at some level.
That sounds pretty major.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, so historically, and again, this happened for a lot of historical reasons, you've got this kind of 1U, 2U form factor, right? Well, that is limiting your fan size. So you are talking about 10 millimeter, 20 millimeter fans. Well, those 20 millimeter fans really have to scream to be able to move air. And they're operating at 20,000 RPM. That's actually not the way you want to run a data center. What you actually want to do is open that enclosure a bit. And so we've got a 100 millimeter enclosure that affords an 80 millimeter fan. So these are big honking fans, and an 80 millimeter fan, as it turns out, these are all power laws, right? And an 80 millimeter fan it's not that it has to do way less work to move way more air than these smaller fans.
Yeah.
So our fans, so we've got 6 80 millimeter fans, and they are able to cool an AMD Milan running full tilt, along with 10 U.2 drives and the 2 M.2s and the terabyte of DRAM. They can cool it operating at 3,000 RPM. And if you don't know what the difference is, what's that?
That's quite a difference.
Oh, it's a huge difference. So people are like, is it on? And it's like, oh, it's on. And you go to the back and you can just feel the heat coming off it. You're like, okay, no, it's definitely on. But that is, but as you want to make a change that's that kind of like modest, even a change like that, or with a DC bus, so we've got a DC bus bar, we've got a power shelf that we do, we've got rectifiers in one power shelf that we run DC up and down the system. you can't buy a DC bus bar based machine from Dell, HP, or Supermicro.
Yep, yep.
And even though anyone operating at any scale knows that that's way more efficient, and because when you have these AC power supplies, the power supplies have fans, right? So you've got redundant AC power supplies going into this one U. Each of those has got a little fan, and you look at those. That thing is blowing hard. You've got all sorts of inefficiencies here. When you want to do even those basic changes, and those are like in many ways the smallest changes we've made, but you are not like tweaking a reference design at that point. At that point, and we don't have a traditional BMC at all. Like there is no baseboard management controller. We've got a service processor of our own design that it's not our own silicon, right? It's an STM32H7, but it's running our own system software. So we actually did our own operating system in Rust. Not a conclusion we came to lightly. We kind of gave it a bit of a tongue-in-cheek name. It's called Hubris, to kind of a tip of the hat about how it is an act of hubris to develop one's own operating system. One of the things that I've done at Oxide is worked on the debugger for Hubris, which we appropriately enough call humility. So spent a lot of time on humility. But once you start making these changes at this kind of basic layer, you end up with the de novo system in a hurry. So we've ended up with our own system in a lot of in great ways. So we've been able to like control this thing top to bottom, which allows us to really control and provide a terrific experience for the end user. And it allows us to do all sorts of things. But just by having our own switch, there are so many things that we can go do. It's using a P4 based switching silicon. P4 is a really interesting language that allows for one to have truly software controlled networks. And there is so much stuff that we can go do uniquely because we're able to control the whole thing top to bottom. So it's been exciting. There's a lot of meat on the bone. It's like we joke that we're like 9 startups within one, and that's actually, it's kind of more like 10 to 12 on any given day.
Oh, okay.
So many business problems. Yeah.
Amazing. So we were talking about, the fundamental changes that you're making to, you can't buy a PC with, or a rack mount compute module, whatever you want to call them, with a DC bus bar. Does that mean that the 19-inch rack is out the window and you've
19-inch rack's out the window? Yeah.
Done your own thing, maybe 21 inches or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Rack geometry. Yeah. Rack geometry is out the window. It is really more, and we really, we treated that as a bit, maybe even too sacrosanct when we first started, and then realized like, wait a minute, actually what people care about is like, it needs to fit through the door, and it needs to, 19 inches is a super weird number. And like the history of that is super weird. And it's not like, it's a dimension that's really tough, and it makes it hard to make an efficient system. And there's a reason why, if you look at the systems in the Open Compute project, they have come away from those geometries because they need to be able to operate compute at scale. And that means bigger fans. That means a DC bus bar. That means and now what even they have not done, if you look at a Facebook Tioga Pass, Meta Tioga Pass, that still has an A-speed BMC on it.
Right.
One of the things that's been exciting about Oxide is we kind of saw the hyperscalers and raised them in terms of our own ambitions. So we have done things that the hyperscalers themselves thought to be too ambitious. So
that's amazing. I love that.
Getting rid of A-speed. Yeah, it's fun. And so another thing that we've done that definitely the hyperscalers thought was too ambitious, there is no AMI bias in our system. There is no bias at all, actually.
Right.
So when the first instruction that's executed coming out of the platform security processor is Oxide software. So we are doing the lowest layer silicon initialization. So this is, that should not be like breaking the sound barrier, but it basically is.
So from my point of view, I have little knowledge of BIOS and x86 systems at this kind of level. Is that the kind of thing where you have to work really closely behind a lot of NDAs with people like AMD to get information about how this thing works?
Yep.
Right. Yep. So you've had to build that relationship, or is this something that your funding, your ambition has kind of allowed you access to?
Yeah, no, this is one of the first things we needed to go do, was really build that relationship. And very grateful to have a kindred spirit in AMD. And AMD believes in what we're doing. Also, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say they did not believe we could do it.
Okay.
So we didn't quite realize this until we had the system booting.
Right.
And the folks that we do with AMD are like, wait a minute, can you show us that again? Like, sure. I mean, it's the system booting. They're like, okay, can you give me a video of that? And like, sure. But what we didn't now realize is that we didn't realize the degree to which others had tried to do this and failed. Okay. And AMD was pretty convinced, not unjustifiably, that we were not going to succeed.
That's interesting, because I know a lot of people are completely unwilling to put their resources into supporting someone if they're too small or they're likely to fail or whatever. So it's fantastic that you got that. That's
well, yeah, it is. I mean, they definitely were like, we have been trying to be very mindful of what we know that help is not on the way, right? We know that like and it's been tough for us. So we try to be very, we have had questions for them for sure. And we try to be, when we ask them questions, we try to make sure we've done all of our homework. And I have to say, as a result, from my perspective, those questions are like works of art. I mean, you look at the questions that we ask them, and just like the question exudes like, wow, this person has really done their homework and has, I mean, when the AMD documentation trivia bowl is up, like I think the Oxide team is gonna win the world championship, because we have just reviewed every syllable of the AMD documentation, and we try to reflect that in the questions we ask. And as a result, like we've done that in part to earn their trust, that like we're not coming to you, we're coming to you because we've got a question that we cannot answer on our own.
Right.
And that's been so that really, and they've been very supportive in that regard. And we've been trying to be very mindful. I think that our biggest challenge, and actually we talked about this, we've got a Discord that we run every week, and then we record it and turn it into a podcast that we call Oxide and Friends. And that's been really important to me, to get the engineering team talking about some things and to talk about kind of what we've done. And in particular, we talked about the actual bring up of the compute sled. And one of the more terrifying moments was when we could not get this thing to come out of reset. And as it turns out, of course, it's like there was a firmware issue in one of the very few pieces of firmware that we did not completely author ourselves in the voltage regulator that we're using. And it was misimplementing a part of the SVI2 protocol, which is what basically the power protocol at the lowest layers of the stack. But problems like that have been a real challenge, because we know that help is not on the way, that we've got to resolve this stuff on our own. And we've been able to do it. We've been able to pull it off. And, the upside of this is a system that, boots like a rocket and does not, there is no UEFI in the system. There's a lot less surface area. We comprehend the system much better. And we are going to be able to deliver. I mean, one of the problems with the kind of extant model is that firmware shields way too much from the system software. So there are things that the system software could actually act on if it knew about it. And the BIOS is actively hiding it. And indeed, like the error model it's called a firmware first model, and the feature is called error cloaking. And you're like, and as someone who writes
the words to it,
it's like, okay, boy, you're really saying it out loud out there. Okay. And I remember when we had an issue with Dell where we were getting these uncorrectable memory errors and trying to understand where they were coming from, and we just wanted to turn this off. And that was like not possible. It's like, no, I'm sorry, we can't turn off error cloaking. Would you just call it error cloaking? But we have already seen the promise of being able to build that entire system, and we have got it working. We've got it booting, and it's it's glorious to watch the entire rack come up and boot. And we just passed compliance, the EMC compliance.
EMC, fantastic.
Oh, it was great, and a huge education for me in terms of
that must be terrifying for a system like this.
Oh, absolutely terrifying. And in particular, I mean, I've had lots of naivete I've been naive about everything at some level, but one of the things I was naive about was like, well, this is like, we know that the CPU has passed EMC compliance. We know that the NIC has passed EMC compliance. We know we're just like adding up a bunch of those. So like that should pass compliance. It's like, no. That doesn't, sorry, it does not work that way, because if these things are operating, if they've got emissions that are at the same frequency, actually, if you take 32 of them, your emissions, like you have the same standard. It's not like there's a different standard for a rack level computer versus a 1U. And something that was like super noisy, but ultimately compliant in a 1U or in a kind of a single CPU, you add up 32 of them and it's like, it's not compliant. And sorry, that's your problem.
By a long way, probably as well. Yeah.
Oh, yes. And so things like spread spectrum clocking have really appreciated it, and then getting into all of the nitty and gritty of not just enabling that, but then because spread spectrum is super interesting, where you're basically introducing deliberate jitter to avoid us all being at the exact same frequency, so we can. Instead of having these kind of big spikes, we can kind of blend it out. But yeah, it was super interesting. It's very, very physical.
But again, this is the kind of thing where, as a system integrator, you probably find that, if you were to buy a rack full of Dell machines, you're not going to put that through EMC. You're just going to install it somewhere.
That's right.
And and you have A, no visibility because you've not done the testing, and B, no control even if you did do the testing.
That's right. Yep. And
so
it's part of why this problem is hard. So one of the other great acts of naivete at Oxide, early on when we saw that there was a lot of VC appetite potentially for this, I'm like, okay, so one of the things that one of the myths that we are about to bust is there is an idea among technologists that you can never get this idea funded. And we are about to prove that you can get this idea funded. So I actually think the biggest Oxide competition is going to come from another startup that comes behind us.
Okay.
Then when raising money was, I mean, it was obviously possible. We did it. It was great, but it was also hard. And I realized that like how important finding the right investor was. And we found that investor. Like the next company behind us can't find that investor. We've got that one. And then I began to realize like, I don't think someone is coming behind us. Like, I don't think, and then you do, as we get to kind of each turn and I learn about some new well of difficulty or complexity. And then we kind of get over that obstacle, and certainly compliance being the latest among them. And now I'm realizing like, yeah, this is really, really hard. And there are a lot of reasons why, I don't think that other folks can. There's a reason people have not taken a swing at this problem, even though it's obvious how important it is and how much demand there is for it.
Right. I mean, you're potentially almost sort of like competing with IBM mainframe type systems in terms of the control that they have over their stuff. Is that correct?
I think I'm about to be interrupted by my daughter. Yep.
My first time I changed my clothes and
sounds good. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's after school here, so sorry about that. Sorry. What was your question?
I was just saying that you're almost up against IBM in terms of their mainframes, the Z series mainframes, in terms of the control that they have over it and the integration and the sort of everything that's gone into that. Compared to Oxide is probably one of the few people who are against that. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are definitely don't view it as a
I'm not talking about the compute and the product. I'm talking about the control, system. The integration,
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there are similarities there. There are big differences too. That we are, and I think in part because of the confidence that we are by our lonesome, it gives us a great luxury to be absolutely open about absolutely everything.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things I loved in your conversation with Rick Althor, which I thought was great. You were asking Rick, I was like, wow, are you like allowed to talk about this? I'm like, oh, Rick's definitely allowed to talk about it. Rick just doesn't know if he's got the necessary 17 hours to talk about it, because one thing that's been exciting for us as a company is we're totally transparent. It's totally transparent about where we are and where we aren't, and where we've stumbled and where we've succeeded. And that is not something that we ever got out. So other folks have taken this fully integrated approach, are IBM and Apple, actually. I mean, it's very much an iPhone kind of M1 model, which is very similar. But both of those companies are pretty secretive, and we are the opposite. And totally transparent, totally open source with all of our software. Hubris is open source, Humility is open source, our control plane is open source. We'll get our schematics out there. We've been open about the proto boards we built. I mean, we really so if there's any allergic reaction I have to the comparison with the mainframe, I think you don't mean it that way, but I think that the allergic reaction is purely that those are such proprietary systems, and we view ourselves as co-designed but not proprietary, if that makes sense.
Right, interesting. Do you mind if we take sort of a step back from the nitty-gritty, the hardware, the electronics, the system design, and sort of have a talk about what a user of your system would see? Like, what is it that you're actually providing?
Yeah, so we're providing all of the software to actually operate this thing as elastic infrastructure. So importantly, we believe that the boundary of the computer should extend to the virtual machine, virtual storage, virtual networking, and its management. So, in the 80s and 90s, we decided that a computer included the operating system, right? Leave Windows aside, that if you bought an SGI machine or an HP machine or an IBM machine or a Sun machine, it included the operating system. That was part of what you got. And that the abstraction included the ability to run a process or to run an application. Like that was included. But that we didn't advance the abstraction as we advanced with the abstraction that we want to use to elastic infrastructure. The abstraction that the computer provided didn't change, and what we believe is that abstraction needs to be able. So what an Oxide rack includes is it includes the API endpoints to go provision. It includes an operator console. It includes a developer console. So you've got the ability to wheel this thing in, power it on, and you should, if you want to hit a browser interface, or you want to hit an API, or you want to hit a CLI, through any three of those vectors, you should be able to start provisioning and go as if you had an Amazon cloud or a GCP kind of cloud in your DC. Now, we're obviously not providing every service, right? We're not providing, Redshift or DynamoDB or what have you. We are really focused on that elastic compute service, kind of an EC2 like equivalent. We are on a nearline storage service, kind of an EBS like equivalent, and on a VPC equivalent, effectively in networking. Those are kind of the atomic bits that that then you can go use to build other things. We will presumably do other services over time, but really trying to provide those Lego bricks that people need to go build their infrastructure.
Okay, that sounds lovely.
Right. Exactly.
Just turn it on and off you go.
Just turn it on and off you go. And that's not the state of the art right now. The state of the art is that you get the stuff in and you debox
whole pile of configuration and as you say, pull it out of the boxes, put it in the rack first.
Miscable it, right? You get the one of the things that's one of the things that we've been able to do at Oxide that's been really neat, that again is one of these where we've been able to leapfrog the hyperscalers, is all the networking is blind baited. So there is no cabling. There's a cabled backplane, but that compute sled has no cabling in it. That compute sled is like a gigantic blade that slides into the rack, locks in, and then you can immediately start provisioning on it, which is pretty cool.
Lovely.
So when you take a clean sheet of paper, there are a lot of problems you can go solve from a performance, from a thermal perspective, environmental perspective, manageability. From a security perspective, there are a whole bunch of problems that we're able to solve at once effectively by having taken a clean sheet of paper, but it makes for a very big build.
Yes. This next question might be a little awkward to answer, and I apologize if it is. Please feel free to dodge it. But that it's kind of around availability of parts. You've built this around an AMD processor and various other things. What happens if some of that goes away? It's no longer available. Are you ready to jump onto the next AMD processor, or how are you planning?
Yeah, totally. And no, that's a great question. And the supply chain has been a huge issue for us. And we've been blessed, as we've been blessed essentially in every domain of the company. We've been blessed with extraordinary people who bring a great deal of expertise. And in particular, Kate Hicks joined us, and she'd come from Apple and done a lot of new product introduction at Apple, and joined us actually before the supply chain crunch.
Okay.
And the first thing Kate asked is like, what are we doing about long lead time parts? She's heading up operations. And we're like, Kate, we don't know what we're building. So Kate's been terrific about taking apart the BOM, finding the long lead time parts, and we had to do some redesign on some things. There were things where we had to find different parts. There's not a simple answer. It kind of depends on the part. On something like the AMD parts, like, yeah, you need to make sure that you've got a deep partnership such that you can secure the inventory you need. Like, there's not a substitute for AMD Milan. I mean, it's an SP3 socket. We could take another SP3 part, but it's going to be an AMD part, right? It's not like you're not putting in a different microprocessor there.
And I guess one of the things that people think about, especially in the last few years, is, as you say, supply chain availability of parts. But there's also the long-term sort of concept of this, where will this part is it still produced in 10 years, for example, 15 years? What kind of commitment do you have there? Is this something where actually you're building, I think you spent the last 3 years or so building this computer? How long are you going to be able to produce it for? And again, apologies if that's an awkward question, but
no. I mean, and I think we've seen this because, I mean, frankly, bluntly, and this may be the direction of the question, but we are at the top of rack switch. We've got a middle of rack built on Intel Tofino, and one of our big questions was the Intel's dedication to Tofino. And Intel is continuing to support Tofino 2, but they are no longer developing Tofino 3 and beyond, which we think is a mistake. But we are grateful that they're continuing to support Tofino 2. We believe that they're going to continue to support Tofino 2 long enough for this product to succeed in the market. And then our Tofino 2 follow-on will be a P4 ASIC of one flavor or another. And fortunately, there are other options out there, and that's something we will have to, at some point, we will need to, that one, I think in many regards, we feel lucky that is the part that's kind of the furthest ahead of where we need it right now. There are the parts that are much more of the headache are like, there's some smaller parts that are there's some TI parts that if you they're not being EOL'd, but they can be very hard to get. In general, for most of these parts, even when they are they're not recommended for new designs, they still tend to be available for a long period of time. So I think we are, by and large, we are on people's flagship parts. So we are on our voltage regulator, for example, is the flagship part from Renesas. Like, we're not worried about that thing being killed anytime soon. We're on the STM32H753. We're not worried about that being killed anytime soon. We're on the LBC55. So I think that, but anything's possible, right? And then you got to just, when you hit that problem, you may need to do some redesign or what have you. You just have to kind of deal with it when you hit it. You have to have the team that can go do that when that happens. But yeah, it's definitely it's a consideration for sure.
Okay. Can we talk about company culture then? What it's like to work for Oxide, just quickly, and then sort of might start thinking about wrapping up because we're running a bit long.
Yeah, I know exactly. I know. It's like 4 a.m. in the UK right now. I mean, culture, I think, as I mentioned, coming out of Joyent, culture is really important to us. And actually, kind of to take it all the way back to the beginning, I kind of saw the importance of shared culture in scouting, and when we started Oxide, we wanted to be very explicit about our principles and values. So we've got 15 values at Oxide, and we ask everyone to memorize them. And in part, it's watching the scouts do it that you got the confidence that I know, like a 10-year-old can memorize 12. You can definitely memorize 15. And that's been really, really important. I think that we did that from before we had our first hire. And we have used it as a lens for absolutely everything. And It's been really helpful. It's been helpful to have us explain why we do things. It's been helpful to, I think that, you can definitely see a bit of an anti-pattern where values can be weaponized at companies. Kind of famously, if you look at and I don't want to pick on them because I think it's on the one hand, what they've done is important, but Amazon's values are so self-contradictory. It's just obvious as an outsider reading them. It's like, okay, these are obviously used to justify any action.
Right.
And especially when you have one of their leadership principles is that leaders are right a lot, which is like, what? Okay, that's a weird one. And so and I love the fact they had 14. They added 2 more, including being Earth's best employer or something. But then they've kind of quietly de-emphasized that one. It's like, maybe you don't want to be Earth's best employer. Screw it. Everyone should be back in the office on Wednesday.
Yeah.
But for us, those values are very earnest. They're very heartfelt. They're very deeply felt. And they're really consequential, and we really mean them. One of the things that was interesting is that as we were kind of contemplating about how to broaden the company, one of the things that we heard from folks at Oxide, it was like, I talked to friends about the values and they think it's bullshit until I talk about the compensation. And when I mentioned the compensation, people realized that it might not be bullshit. And what they were talking about is that we are not only transparent about our compensation at Oxide, but it's also uniform. Everyone at Oxide makes the same salary, which feels totally outlandish. And it's not necessarily a point of principle. I think that we have believed that it wouldn't survive in perpetuity, but it has survived. It's surviving pretty well right now, and we're not about to end it anytime soon.
Okay.
And that has had really interesting consequences. It has changed the way people hire, because anyone that you're hiring, you're bringing in as a peer. And if you're bringing in someone as a peer, which is to say you are not subordinate to them, they are not subordinate to you, how does that change the way you think about them? And we have got high expectations for the people that we hire. And there can be, I think, the most detrimental effect, or the one I worry about the most, is the difficulty in having someone very early in their career, because we are paying effectively a senior salary effectively. And we are really not a fit for someone very early in their career. And I would like to believe that a bigger Oxide will be a fit for someone earlier in their career, but that's not where we are right now. But it's had really extraordinary ramifications in ways that are positive. As one Oxide engineer that had grown up at a particularly notable large company, famous for its objectives and key results, as he said to me, I didn't realize how much energy I was spending on compensation until I didn't have to think about it anymore. And when I could actually use all that part of my brain that's figuring out how to get, this year's bonus, can actually just figure out how to go build this outlandish thing.
Right.
It just is a much better use of our finite energy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like it. So that's sort of a flat compensation. Is that also flat hierarchy as well? I mean, you're the CTO, but you're kind of not far above in inverted commas the others. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, we're definitely not command and control. I mean, it's a challenge, right? Because it's like, by being flat from a compensation perspective, it kind of allows us to solve the problem at hand. And the problem at hand is, how do we figure out who does what? And how do we prioritize things? And but you've got other ways of solving that are not command and control hierarchy, where you've got rival directors figuring out who's responsible for what. Like, you can actually, when you kind of take compensation out of it, in part, if someone steps up and says, hey, I want to take on this as leadership, and I want to I'll lead the charge on this. You don't have this thing like, oh, well, you're just doing that to get a raise, or you're going to, because you're going to be in L6 or whatever, or this is going to be part of your promo package. It's like, no, you're doing this because you've got the ability to do it and the interest to do it, and you're doing it for this kind. And there's just a lot more organic support for someone doing that. It's like, oh, thank God, thank you, thank you. And then when we have added folks to the company, because it is a challenge, absolutely a challenge to keep track of that prioritization. There's so many details. So as some of our most recent adds to the company have been folks who are tasked with helping us all keep track of those details and prioritize.
Right.
And they find that they're and we've had just added some extraordinary people who've been able to ramp up really quickly in an environment that's really supportive, because people are like, oh, thank God, Megan is here. Thank God, Angela is here. And like, we can now help these folks keep track of the details, find the gaps, and you find that by kind of flipping it around, it's like, let's focus on solving the problem, and then we can figure out like what structure is going to help solve the problem. And a traditional command and control structure is not great for a lot of problems and creates a lot of other problems. And it obviously, it puts a lot on us on hiring, because it's like, you've got to hire the right folks. This is not the right environment for everyone, because this is not going to be, it's like, people need to help. It's incumbent upon all of us to help us figure out our own structure. And that's not the right fit for everybody. But for those folks for whom it is the right fit, I think that we can and have been able to do something really extraordinary together, because everybody is able to bring their own truly unique value. And it is a wild company. And something, I joke that this is like the only analog is like a heist movie starring the Muppets, directed by Quentin Tarantino. Like, that's Oxide. It's just like this. There's this level where it's kind of delightfully eclectic and in so many different axes. And I love that about who we are. And I think, but in order to be able to express that, it is definitely, you need to add the right folks. It's not a fit for everybody, but for those for whom it is the right fit, again, I think we've been able to do something really extraordinary together.
Yeah. That sounds amazing. Well done. Thank you.
Yeah. So far, so far we've got a long way to go, always a long way to go, but we're getting there.
Very good. Great. I think that's probably a good point to wrap up, if you're okay. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about or shout out or mention quickly?
No, absolutely. No, I've been listening to some of the past interviews you've done. And I would encourage with a lot of kindred spirits. I love all the kind of the emphasis on the kind of the maker movements and open hardware and so on. It's been really exciting. I would really encourage people to check out our Oxide and Friends Discord. Again, that's all been recorded. It's available as a podcast. It's got a great back catalog there. And I think the demographic that's interested in these kind of conversations is also going to be really interested in diving deep with us. And we talk a lot about what we're doing at Oxide, but also talk a lot about what's kind of happening more broadly in tech and kind of the human side of all of this. So I think people are going to really find stuff there to like.
Thank you. There's a link to that in the description if anyone's interested. So do check that out. Yeah, it's great podcast. Anyway, okay, I think that's all from us then. Thank you everybody for watching. And next week we'll be joined by Ryan Castellucci. But that's all from us today.
Great. Thanks,
Bye, everybody.